So I have with me today Dr. John Colarusso, who is a professor of mythology, linguistics, and anthropology at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. He also holds a doctorate in linguistics from Harvard and MA and PhD in philosophy from Northwestern and Cornell, respectively. He's also edited and written seven volumes and over 100 articles. The most recent volume is on Tales of the Narts, and the Tales, which is published by Princeton University Press, and it draws on his expertise in the languages of the Caucasus and Indo-European languages, as well as historical linguistics. His forthcoming work focuses on the size of language, which is a mathematical linguistics problem. And another book he's working for, his forthcoming work, is for Princeton University Press, which deals with historical myth and more generally. Oops, I don't like how I said that. Let's do it again. Okay. All right.
Not so fast. You're going very fast.
Yep, that happens to me. Okay. Hello and welcome. I'm here with Dr. John Colarusso, who is a professor of linguistics, mythology, and anthropology at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. He also holds a doctorate in linguistics from Harvard and a master's and PhD in philosophy from Northwestern and Cornell, respectively. He's an author of 7 books and over 100 articles. The most recent volume is called Tales of the Narts. And Tales of the Narts is published by Princeton University Press, and it draws on his expertise in the languages of the Caucasus, Indo-European, and historical linguistics. He also, his forthcoming work, focuses on the size of language, which is a problem in mathematical linguistics. And his forthcoming book with Princeton University Press deals with historical mythology more generally. And this is what this series of recordings should be a prelude for. So welcome, and thank you, John, for being here.
Thank you, Will. I'm pleased to be here. It's a great opportunity.
So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit of what you would like to accomplish with the book and with these recordings.
Well, I'd like to offer to the public, and particularly to younger people, insights into the kind of work I do and the kind of thrills and happy discoveries that I uncover in the course of my work, because I think the kinds of things that myth reveals, when you look at it, particularly back through time, are important to young people who are trying to identify an adult life, to seek their way into a future, because they offer answers to questions of identity, origin, roots, and the way life should frame itself. In a way, what myth does is it offers large-scale meanings to events and patterns in life, but meanings that are very old and have withstood millennia of time, hundreds of generations, and been passed down to us from ancestors we, in many cases, no longer even know about. So I think that it's as close to a time machine as anything we're going to have. And I think that today, when a young person is saying, who am I, where did I come from, maybe older answers like, well, you graduated from high school, blah, blah. These are no longer satisfying answers.
Shallow roots.
Shallow roots. We need deeper roots, and we can get them. It's possible to uncover them. And I think that that's what this type of effort offers. And I would like to take it from the ivory tower and put it out somewhere in the world where more people can enjoy it and appreciate it.
And which brings you here to LA Center Studios on Relativity School's campus. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the particular route that you've been focusing on for a lot of your career, not only Indo-European studies and linguistics, but also very specifically the languages of the Caucasus region. And what does that have to do with our roots? I mean, I know we're all Caucasians and all, or
that's
a word that people use in the West, but what does that even mean? Where does that come from? Who are they? Who and why do people have that term at all?
Well, the Caucasus is an area that until recently was entirely dominated by Russia. Now there are 3 independent countries on the southern periphery. There's Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. But the part that I really zero in on, and it's a very complex area, about 50 languages in this area, is the area you would see in the background when you watch the Sochi Olympics. You see those beautiful big mountains. And those are the mountains of the Caucasus. And I work on the people who were once at Sochi and going up along that coast, over those mountains, and going right up into southern Russia. And for historical reasons, political reasons, these people were in eclipse. They were sort of hidden from view. And I think that what they do, what the folklore from this area does, is it plugs a hole in the patterns of folklore we see in Europe and the patterns of folklore we see in Asia.
Why do we say that? How does it plug that hole?
Well, geography plays a role in some sense,
Okay.
and the Caucasus itself is right between these two zones, or these two historical
Okay.
regions. And I was trained in phonology, phonetics at Harvard, and I was introduced to one of these languages by a professor there, late Calvert Watkins, who couldn't believe what was being claimed for this recording he handed me on a little cassette, and that the language had only two vowels, for example, something like that. And I worked on this language. I worked on a bunch of related languages, Circassian, Abkhazian. The one on the cassette was a language called Abaza. And then I learned a language called Ubykh, which is now almost extinct. And these languages were a theoretical challenge. They were extraordinary. They had an enormous number of consonants. They pushed the human ability to distinguish sound systems right to its limit.
Did you tell me 81
Yes,
sounds?
Ubykh has 81 distinctive sounds. Abkhaz dialect 72, Circassian 67.
How could they be that distinctive?
Yeah, well, they have a rule. You don't talk with your mouth full, not because you won't be understood, but because you'll be misunderstood. So it's quite extraordinary. I had a good year. I was able to manage these languages. And when I ended up at McMaster, there was no one around to work with anymore, so I turned to volumes of mythology that I had in these languages, just in an effort to keep them up and alive. Mm-hmm. And then my wife comes along about 15 years later and says, "What's all this in the file drawer?" And I said, "Well, those are some myths I translated. Get them out of the file drawer," she said, "get them published." And of course, one has to keep one's wife happy. And Linda was very wise, and in fact, that was my first book. Which is Nart Sagas from the Caucasus, Tales of the Circassians, Abkhazians, and Ubykh. And then a scholar from Ossetia, Tamerlan Sabiev, he and I collaborated and brought the Tales of the Narts from the Ossetians. And there's more. Even the Chechens have a volume. I have that on my shelf and have not had a chance yet to translate that one.
So we're going to talk a little bit more generally about mythology, and that's what these recordings will be. But before we do, I want to zoom in a little bit on this expertise of yours, because I feel like it's only by going that deep into an individual or a concentration of cultures can you possibly begin to have an understanding of what's going on very generally in mythology. Especially these cultures, because they seem to have influenced so many things, all the way from India to Europe, right? So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about just a little bit about these stories and a little bit about how these stories play, and giving us an example of how these stories plug a hole in some of the Eastern and Western stuff.
Okay. Well, first of all, these people were geographically positioned not only between Asia, Iran, India, and Europe, but they also were in touch with numerous people who passed through what is now southern Russia, Ukraine, either on their way east to China or on their way west into Europe. So in a sense, they were in touch with anybody who was anybody for probably 2,000 or 3,000 years. And they have material in their myths, of course, which comes from the local lore of the mountains and material peculiar to their own world and their own history. But they've borrowed an enormous amount of material from these neighbors that passed by, and also gave a lot of material to those neighbors that passed by, because they told very good tales. They were very good at that.
They were storytellers.
And they were storytellers. And one example I think is particularly good is that of the Amazons. And somehow they passed that on to the Greeks. The Greeks had some dealings with these people. And it turns out that the word Amazon itself is not Greek. It's transparently Circassian, and it means the forest mother. And she's a lady that runs around in the forest with a band of followers, all women, and they're warriors. And it's a kind of tragic romance story, but there it is in the Nart sagas. The name Nart itself means hero, but that's from an Iranian language. And I don't mean the Iranian of Iran, but rather the lost branch of Iranian that was an Indo-European group spanning Hungary to Western China and practicing nomadism on the great prairies of Eurasia. They're copied or represented in Tolkien by the Rohirrim.
The horse riders.
The horse riders,
right.
yeah. So
and then maybe also, I think in Game of Thrones, you have this Dothraki or something like that.
Dothraki are also a little more barbaric than, than the real ones. But Jackson did a good job with the Rohirrim. He captured that pretty well.
Yeah.
So these people, well, you also get the battles with the great serpents, this sort of thing, and you get a kind of figure that looks a bit like Odin from Norse. It's astonishing. And in the course of translating this material, because I was familiar, just as a kind of self-indulgence and hobby, with Norse and Celtic and Greek and Russian
languages and myths, right?
Yeah, and Indian lore, Iranian lore. Harvard was anything if not thorough, so I studied Farsi from Iran and all these other things. I was astonished to find all these parallels that leapt out at me from this material that I initially began to look at simply for self-serving purposes of keeping my languages alive. And suddenly the whole purpose of my efforts shifted and became much more profound, much deeper, and then basically took over the course of my career. So I spend most of my professional time now on the mythology.
So I wanted to tell the audience a little bit about a couple nights ago. So a couple nights ago, we were at the Silk Road House in Berkeley, California, and for an event of storytelling.
Yes. And
they told stories that you had translated to English from the Narts. And I was wondering if you could speak just a little bit about that experience.
That to me was an amazing evening. I saw three people who, one of whom followed one of the tales almost verbatim, very, very precisely, but the other two sort of improvised and came up with a combination of features. And what I realized I was watching was a tradition that had been almost lost, smothered, in a way inaccessible, not just for historical or political reasons, but also because of the difficulties of some of these languages. Some of these languages are arguably among the most complex on earth. But I had managed somehow to bring them out to a form in English that seemed to make the Circassians and Ossetians happy about things.
You made them accessible to a whole...
And I made it accessible to a wider world.
Yeah.
And here I saw bards. I saw modern bards now taking this as part of the repertoire and promulgating it forward, speaking it forward, bringing it out to the public, and in a way launching my baby. And there it went. It took wing, and off it goes into the wild beyonder.
That's not the only launch. I think you also told me that somebody's making cartoons with your translations, and that's very cool.
It's caused a revival of this tradition back in the Caucasus and in the diaspora members in Turkey and in Jordan, where I now see cartoons based on these tales. I also see there's another scholar, a Circassian scholar, who is tracking down still living bards in the area who are telling tales, and this man will then put them up on Facebook, and some of these tales are startling and new. And one of them, for example, gives insight into, believe it or not, the Romanian storm god. And the Romanian storm god, uniquely within Indo-European, is the dragon that is defeated everywhere else.
Oh,
okay,
I see.
There you
I
go.
see.
You know? So,
interesting.
and because when the storm god fights the great dragon in the Rig Veda, or Thor fights Jormungand, the great serpent in Norse lore, and all this. The guy wins. Well, in Thor, they both die, right? In Norse, they both die. Thor and Jormungand both die. But in the Rig Veda, the great storm god defeats the serpent. But the serpent has lightning, he has hail, he has wind.
Zeus versus Typhon, or Apollo versus...
Yeah. And so, but in Romania, and this reflects the lost traditions of the Dacians and Geti, who initially occupied that territory and were conquered by the Romans and became the people who gave us Romanian, with the Latin now in the mouths of Dacians and Geti. They preserved their traditions, and for some reason the snake won out there. was never really challenged, and that's the sole place where the older snake storm god still survives.
Interesting. So I have I know a little bit about what's coming. You and I have been talking for a little while now, and so I know some of the absolute diamonds and gems ahead. And I was thinking it'd probably be a good idea to give a little tease of what's coming. So maybe, for example, let me ask a couple of questions. Maybe like, what are some of the hidden ways that we know that these stories, that these people are so present in Europe?
Oh, well, one has to understand what Indo-European means. It's an adjective, and it is a technical term devised by linguists starting back in the early 19th century. And it arises from the same kind of thinking that gave rise to Darwin and his theories of evolution. And the idea is that some languages are related to other languages, and it is a very special sense of that term. And what that means is not that they sort of look alike or that they sort of treat, certain clauses the same kind of way, the kind of thing you would think of, say, with Chomsky and modern linguistics, this sort of stuff. No, it means that these languages are actually sisters, that they are sister communities, and that the language itself, as the language of a community, in either case, goes back to an original mother community that had a mother language. And we retrieve that by comparing words across a variety of languages. So English brother, Russian brat, Greek frater, Persian beradar, and we make a kind of legalistic case. We lay out all the data and we reconstruct the original. And then we try to locate where that might have been, spoken originally and whatnot. My theory was always that it was in the North Caucasus. I try to compare them to the mother language of Circassian, Uzbek, Abkhaz. And geneticists have recently told me that my theory has been vindicated, that in fact they seem to have been in the North Caucasus. And what these people did, they invented horse nomadism. As far as we know, they were the first ones. And this gave them enormous mobility, and they spread out
the
west.
internet of their day, right?
The internet, yeah. They spread out west as far as Ireland and east as far as Western China. But the ones that were in Western China on the Silk Road, Silk Road House, those languages have been replaced by Turkic languages like Kazakh and Uyghur and Uzbek. But we still have the documentation from the earlier stages of those languages, and they brought with them, of course, not only the languages, but their folklore and their habits of dress and whatnot. And there's a whole range of things that we practice and we have as daily parts of our lives that actually go back to this period and this time that is otherwise historically a blank.
So to help us understand who we are, give me an example. So
why do we wear trousers? Okay. Well, of course, the Greeks ran around in togas, the Romans ran around in togas, whatnot. Well, those were local forms of dress, probably adapted to the extreme heat. And of course, when you get to India, you see something similar even today. But if you're going to ride a horse, you're not going to do it in a toga. You're going to put your trousers on. Otherwise, the inside of your leg is going to be all sore. You're going to put your boots on, which are now shoes.
So these are like early cowboys.
Yeah, they're cowboys.
Driving steer and everything.
That's exactly what they're doing. Because if you're riding through brush, for example, and you've got sandals on, your toe's going to get broken. So in some ways, it's hard to see these people because they're very close to us in a sense. And in a mundane, daily way, not just some kind of remote, glorified document or a book like Plato or something like that. No, this is a practical aspect.
We wear pants.
Yeah, we wear pants. And for example, particularly with the Romans, we see the empire sort of collapsing and being overrun in 450. And we go into the Dark Ages. The Romans were wearing togas, or some of them wearing something like trousers, sort of beginning to adapt already. And they emerge in the historical period again in the early medieval, wearing trousers, wearing shoes or boots-like objects, wearing chainmail.
Where's chainmail come from?
Chainmail comes from these warriors from the steppes, from these early cowboys.
And
jousting, things like this. We have images of these people jousting 1,000 years before anything like that's done in Europe.
So this is a vein I got to tap into a second. So jousting, chainmail, heavy armor, armored horses, towers with maidens at the top, and flags
with scarves coming down their pointy hats.
And then you have the pointy hats, and then of course in folklore we have all these. In Arthurian legend we have all this idea of the scarf as a token, and that's there too.
That's there too. It's as though you're reading about chivalric Europe, and you're not. not.
It's like literally Europe before Europe.
That's right. Where did it all come from? Where did the Europeans pick this all up? In one of my talks, I'm going to talk about King Arthur.
Yes.
And you go from ancient Irish stuff with Cuchulainn and all the Hierophant and the Fenians and all this, and you go from that into King Arthur. Something has happened. There's some major change here. There are a few of the Celtic figures left. Guinevere is one. But there's so many other new characters, so many other new themes and whatnot. Someone has brought something into that tradition and blended it into the older Celtic material. No one could figure out what had happened. Most Arthurian scholars just figured it was a local or evolution of some sort. I think it's very clear in some ways that these a very late version of the Indo-European expansion, the steppe Iranian expansion, that they brought a lot of this in, and this is Nart Saga material, or it's material we see in the Nart Saga still from this intermediate zone in the Caucasus.
So this is actually one of the reasons we first got in touch.
Yes.
Something I was very interested in. I think if I remember correctly, so one of the focuses in the Grail legends has to do with the association of the Grail with the child and the Grail with metallurgy. And so I had gotten really into this character Batraz, and so what had happened is and Sosruko, and so I had been talking with a guy came to speak here who was the writer producer of RoboCop and Starship Troopers, and we got to talking about RoboCop, and got to talking, and he talked about these the Japanese man made of metal, and I told him about Sosruko and the story of him being made from metal, and so then, and I had just devoured your books at this point, and this one hadn't come out yet. The Tales of the Narts, they had not come out yet. I devoured
It's just new this year. Yeah.
And it's so great to talk with you before it came out, and I devoured it when it did. But one of the things that was so interesting in there is this focus on the man made of metal, and this is one of my favorite stories. If I may crack into this egg, because here you have the story of Demeter and Demophoon. You have the story of Achilles, and what are some of the others? Several.
Demophon.
Right. So in this story you have. Well, actually, could you tell us? I won't ask for the long version, but the short version of the story. What happens with these? Well,
Will, I have to say that some of your insights on this have enlightened my own thinking on the topic, and have convinced me that we are dealing with metallurgy myths. And that the shift from a Bronze Age to an Iron Age was probably one of the biggest technological innovations and evolutionary steps in culture and political organization that humans have undergone. And I think what we're seeing, excuse me, what we're seeing here, is a shift.
We'll edit a cut. No worries. Chop that part out. Have a sip of coffee.
The laryngeal spasm.
Just start with a nice
what we're
sentence.
seeing here is a hero.
Start over, so the start of the sentence is clear.
Okay. From your
From what we're seeing.
Yeah, no. I think what we're seeing, the shift from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age is one of the biggest transitions in human technology, human society, human politics that has happened in our race, in our species, comparable to going from stone to bronze, and almost comparable, say, to the discovery of fire, something like that. Look around you, look at all the steel that supports your buildings, your car, everything else, and none of this would have been possible if we'd been in the Bronze Age. So what we have here is a figure, a hero, who typifies the technological innovation and represents in some way, in a minimal form, what the technology is. And this is in Circassian or Basran, this is Sosrokwa. And he is born from a rock, basically ore. He comes out red hot. He has to be quenched. So red hot like a...
He's taken out by tongs, literally the metallurgist tongs.
By the god of the forge named Klepsh in Circassian, Anuj in Abkhaz, Kurlegan in Ossetian. He's taken out with tongs and tempered. He's dunked into vats of water, just as you would temper a red hot piece of iron and to make it into something very hard. And he's hardened. He comes out bluish black, just like tempered steel. And he actually says in one story, I am alloy, I am steel alloy.
He's a man of steel.
He actually says this, yes. And he's soft and vulnerable only where the tongs held him.
That sounds familiar.
Yes,
kind of like Achilles.
Yeah, it's just like Achilles.
And if I remember correctly, he doesn't just put him in water, he puts him in water and then in fire as well.
Back and forth, the temper, working the steel, making the steel hard.
So here we have the Dimophoon myth, right? Where he's put into the fire to make him immortal.
And Thetis, the mother of Achilles, did the same thing, trying to make him immortal. What the Greeks were doing was reinterpreting the heating. They didn't understand any longer what was going on. They had lost the sense of the myth, and were just attributing the mother roasting the child, or the goddess roasting the child to try to roast the mortality out of him, to make him invulnerable and eternal. And then having, in the case of, the meter is interrupted in her effort to make Dimophoon immortal, but Thetis is interrupted by her husband, who's immortal, doesn't understand what's going on, and she has dunked him by his heel into the stream to temper him. And of course his heel is soft, and of course we still have the idea of the Achilles heel. And here in Sisukla we see a more elaborate version of the myth that adheres more faithfully to the original sense.
Far more transparent, right? It's very clear that he's being held by tongs. Okay, so let me just...
And the blacksmith's still there. And in Ireland you get a vague association of the hero Cuchulainn with the blacksmith thing, but you don't get the iron.
And there was the other one. The other is the founding of Athens. Is based on the myth of Erichthonius, where the ejaculation at Athena that misses goes into the ground, and from that is born Erichthonius, who is the founder of Athens. And here we have, that's also how the stone becomes impregnated.
That's how the stone becomes pregnant. There's a shepherd, sort of like Aphrodite and Anchises, the shepherd prince. This is a shepherd who sees the radiant woman Satanaya bathing and ejaculates, and it lands on the stone, and the stone becomes pregnant.
So we're talking about the founding of Athens. We're talking about the Eleusinian mysteries, which are some of the biggest part of the religious experience.
With Demeter.
And we're talking about the Iliad and Odyssey. I mean, those are three of the biggest pillars of Greek history, and this is a story that comes before it, that makes them transparent.
And a distant echo in Ireland, even out there. Yeah.
So, and now let's jump forward thousands of years to this character a little bit more. So we have, I think, a similar character, also made of steel, is Batraz, right? And he's called the Man of Iron repeatedly. And he flies in the sky.
Yeah, lives up in the clouds.
And he hears prayers, and he comes down from the clouds. He's always blue or red, because he's blue steel or red hot.
Red hot.
And he comes down and he saves the day. This sounds wildly familiar.
Yeah, he's indestructible. He's indestructible and basically beyond anyone's control but his own. And sometimes he does good, sometimes he does evil. And Superman never does evil.
Well, I don't know if you've seen the new movies, but this is it's wild, thousands of years before Superman, and we have the core archetypal character.
I would love to have gone back to the creators of Superman and ask them if somehow they knew someone that had told them about some Nart sagas.
I would love to know that too, and I have heard from one of my very intelligent students that Superman was written by a Jewish man.
Yes.
And so I'm very interested to know how much he knew about the Golem myth, because I believe that Golem probably has some relation to this as well. And of course, now we're talking about the Frankenstein, Adam made from clay and brought to life. We're talking about the creation of a being and the bringing of them to life. And of course, this is where the conversation came up with the writer and producer of Starship Troopers. And
I think what we have to understand, we talk about origins and roots and whatnot. Origins are often seen as being very ancient, very remote, and there's a sense in which that's true. And we have to offer one thing. Myth does have to offer is a sight back into the past. And my new book would be called Deep Sight in some way. I think it's the working title. But origins are also right with us in a way. And they're popping up all the time. And here we have, in the case of Superman and its invention, what was the early 1930s or late 1920s or so? It was during the Depression. That here again, it pops up. And maybe they never talked to anyone about Narts. But these things, these are what we, Jungian archetypes, they come to us, and they'll take manifestation in certain forms. And you know, Superman's suit is blue.
Right, blue and red.
And red with his symbol and whatnot. And even to that detail, we have a recapitulation of the older patterns that we saw. So in some ways, origins are both very ancient and right in front of our noses.
So, with that said, I very much look forward to these recordings, and as you can help us understand who we are, where we come from, and maybe even help us to see because history does tend to repeat itself, where we're going. But before we jump in, I was wondering if you could just give us a quick overview of the maybe the titles of each talk.
Well, I'm going to talk about putting on the mythic lens and how we have a special way of looking at life and our meaning in the world, and that we call this myth, basically. Myth is the encoded version of this as it's told in stories, but it ties into deeper psychological processes. And so the first episode would be called Putting on the Mythic Lens. Then I take up the issue that we just discussed, really, of origins. Trying to be kind of clever, I would say it's the origin story of our origin stories. And if one knows some linguistic theory, one can make a pretty solid argument that in some ways every society, every tradition will have something like myth, and that it's going to be the oldest material it has. Okay, so, and it's been sustained and passed down because it ties in to the origins that pop up under our noses, the contemporary forces that drive our lives. Then I'm going to talk about why we wear trousers. There's a whole lot more to go with that. Okay. And then I was going to have a special episode that went in specifically into the Nart sagas as a new tradition brought online, so to speak, into our understanding of the world and its tales. And there's lots there to talk about, things that are new to our understanding and our grasp of things. I was going to particularly focus in on the Amazons, because I think now we can answer where they come from. The scholar from Stanford, Adrienne Mayer, has a beautiful book on Amazons. She and I have collaborated also on some other projects. And this ties into some visions and that involve feminism, not all forms of feminism, but it certainly is a theme for our times, particularly for women, but also for men. And then I was going to talk about the Nart influences or Nart parallels that we find elsewhere, particularly in King Arthur. That would be another one. I think it's important to talk about the peoples who have preserved these traditions. So I'm going to have one episode talking particularly about the tiny nations of the North Caucasus and some of their peculiar cultural features, such as prestige for the women, things like that. No one can read myth without sitting back and thinking, what in the world's going on sometimes? It is weird. There's just no other, it's uncanny. There's no other way to describe it. I have an episode where I try to deal with that as best I can. I'm not at all sure I can answer all the questions surrounding this peculiar foundation. I would say this, that in some ways it's the wine cellar of the human mind where the really good old stuff is.
As one of my mentors would say, the granary.
Yeah. At one point I did, when there were wars in the Caucasus, I served as a security advisor and back channel for the Clinton administration. And I indulged in politics for 9 years, and people ask me how did I do it, and I say it's very simple. The transition between myth and politics is absolutely seamless, and I had very little in the way of adjustments to make in that effort like that. And finally, I will talk about the social and communal nature of myth, how it provides a basis for not just individual identity and sense of purpose, but for the identity of an entire nation or people in some way, and how it is sort of the wine cellar of the human mind, and how we, our fantasies and our shared thoughts, as intimate as we may feel, are generally fantasies and thoughts that we share with many other people, and don't know that. And yet that helps define what a people is in a way. So I wanted to conclude with that kind of talk.
Well, on that, actually, let me ask one final question, because you heard slip out of me earlier. It says something like, "We're all Caucasians."
Yeah.
And that slipped right out because the way that we identify with people like ourselves, and so a lot of this seems to be about identification and who we identify with, and perhaps expanding our range of identification, as you said, beyond our high school. So I wonder if you might.
Well, let me first say how the word Caucasian was applied to white people. There was an anthropologist in Germany in the 19th century who collected skulls. And this was back in the time when we were just trying to figure out how people looked, and were astonished to find people that were brown or very short or very tall or whatnot. And he collected skulls, and he measured all the skulls. and some of the skulls are very round and short, some of them are very long and whatnot. But there were some that were just right, the Goldilocks skulls. Not too long, not too short. And these skulls all came from peoples in the Caucasus that had been killed in wars and stuff. And so he said, well, we must all come from the Caucasians, and then the other ones, the skulls are too long or the skulls are too short, are derived.
So it comes from a
this,
scholar. It doesn't come from the people.
No,
Okay.
no, they don't think of themselves that way. In fact, there were Africans in Abkhazia. There were 2 or 3 villages of Africans that had probably been there, we don't know how long. They were perfectly assimilated culturally into the society, and unfortunately in the Georgian-Abkhazian War of the 1990s, 1992 to 93, we don't quite know what happened to them. We're afraid that maybe they didn't survive that ordeal. And you get people, though, I think the thing that's interesting about the Caucasus is that we think it's what we call an Ice Age refugium. The people that were running around in the Paleolithic, whatnot, in Europe, Eurasia, when the great ice sheets came down again, they took refuge in Spain, Italy, what's now Greece, and then in the Caucasus and Anatolia. And they differentiated, their languages differentiated in those zones. And then as the ice sheets retreated, they went back out again. And so in a way, you have in the Caucasus, because of all the mountains, a kind of natural place to take shelter. And so many of the customs, many of the habits, and much of the folklore of that region is very, very old. And the people just look like the ordinary people in Europe, and to look at them as an anthropologist, you think, well, it should be nothing exciting here, but they sort of living proof that culture is really what makes us shockingly, say, different or recognizable in some way, because their cultures are very different. And I think that respect for women, for example, is very prominent among certain of the peoples there, particularly Circassians, Abkhazians, Ossetians. Respect for elderly. So they have cultures in some ways that have very striking virtues about them. We consider virtuous. And
incredible
also,
honor.
Tremendous honor, heroism, loyalty, these
Chivalry.
things. And chivalry, and for example, when World War I broke out, there were people from the high mountains that came down to fight for the Tsar in the Russian effort.
He told me, yeah.
That wore chainmail, came down wearing its ancestrally heirlooms, chainmail, broadswords, and bucklers.
Well, as the story, right, it says when the son's ready to go to war, he says, hey, where's my father's war chest?
Yeah, where's the old stuff, the good stuff that I can go back to, yeah.
So as far as identification, expanding identification beyond maybe the high school football team or something like that, there are severe dangers here. And I was wondering, the last thought, take us to the danger zone. Tell us what's dangerous about this work.
Well, this is almost as dangerous as handling plutonium, and I warn my students when they take my courses that that's the case. And I think the fallacy here is the lapse into racist thinking, and we saw that with the Nazis and their abuse of the Aryan ideas that arose from Indo-European work. Apparently, the Indo-Europeans, they call themselves something like that, Aryans. You get the word an aristocrat and whatnot. And I think that no one doing that linguistics really believed in racial partitions like this after 1870 or so. The Nazis were still carrying on 60 years later with these ideas that no one really embraced. But I think the message now is not one of racial division, it's one of cultural transmission, cultural sharing, and common heritage in some way. So when I teach my big classes, there will be people who say, I've had Gaelic speakers from Ireland, I had a Vedic priest from India in the class and whatnot. And when they're done, they suddenly understand that somehow they share a common sense of community that is, in terms of conventional history, totally lost. And this kind of material can provide that. It's now a new message. It's a message of common heritage and common humanity. It's just the opposite of what Hitler wanted.
Sounds like the Age of Aquarius or something.
Sort of like that, yes. And you had a bit of that with Joseph Campbell. I mean, you could see
Right.
that coming. I mean, he saw that, and we're just reinforcing some of his insight. I'm not going to say follow your bliss. I'm going to say, share your heritage.
Oh,
That's
I like
what
that.
I would say. Share your heritage. Share your dreams. Because you'd be surprised, a lot of people have them.
Well, I'm really looking forward to the talk. I want to thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you very much for delivering the first podcast to my students, who are very appreciative. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad. Thank you for the opportunity.